a state-of-the-art transit network called Flash, giving residents a new, reliable option for getting where they want to go. What makes BRT different? BRT features enhancements that improve efficiency and reliability, such as off-board fare collection. Riders will not have to wait for others to pay their fare before boarding. Simply pay at the payment station, then board BRT at any door when it arrives. Level boarding. Boarding BRT will be easier and quicker for strollers and riders with disabilities. Near-level boarding allows for smooth and accessible boarding. You won't need to mount your bike outside BRT, just bring it on board. Getting on BRT is quick and easy for everyone. BRT's frequent schedule means if you miss one BRT, you only wait a few minutes for the next one. BRT's enhanced weather-protected stations will feature real-time travel information, so you will know when the next BRT is arriving. BRT makes fewer stops than a traditional bus, reducing the time spent at stations and allowing you to get where you need to go quickly. Transit signal priority. Traffic signals sense when the BRT is approaching. Signals may turn green early or extend a green light to help the BRT get through the intersection when certain conditions are met. Where possible, along some corridors, BRT travels in its own lane, enabling it to move quickly past traffic congestion. Queue jumps can help BRT vehicles bypass congestion or delays at intersections. Taking public transit is better for the environment. By not driving a car, each rider reduces their carbon footprint. BRT can hold as many as 90 passengers. That's a lot of cars off the road. Sit back and relax. The BRT service will allow you to avoid many of the headaches and stress associated with driving. Use the onboard Wi-Fi to catch up on a book or start your workday during your commute. Or simply relax while BRT
and I'm
gets
joined
you to your
this morning by
destination.
two members of our consulting
BRT,
team, Emily Coley from
bus,
Tool Design,
reliable,
and also
relaxing
Alex Rixey from
transit.
Fair and Pierce, DC.
Making trips around the county
We're going to
more
transition
comfortable
from
and
the
convenient.
discussion of the schools
And on
briefing
BRT.
on recommendations this morning to a briefing on the transportation recommendations for the SSP. There are 14 transportation recommendations in the working draft document. We have a set of recommendations that focus on the integration of Vision Zero into the LATR process, and Emily will be taking you through that information. We have another set of recommendations that focus on revising the congestion standards in our TOD areas, and I'll be walking you through that information. And we'll be closing with the recommendations that pertain to a proposed new policy review process, and we'll be wrapping up with Alex on that. So, Emily, if you want to get started, we can start with you on the Vision Zero information.
Yep, thanks, Eric. So like Eric said, I'm going to be walking through the Vision Zero related recommendations for the transportation element. And so this kind of part of the recommendations is laid out kind of first and foremost, the beginning of the working draft chapter on transportation highlights that prioritizing human life over mobility is the objective of the road system and transportation network. So the previous version of the LATR, the local area transportation review guidelines, and the previous SSP, it came out around the same time that the county adopted Vision Zero as a goal for the transportation system. So those previous versions didn't really take into account that goal for the county. And so now that that's been in place for a number of years, it's a good time to reevaluate and incorporate those into the development review process. So the first recommendation related to Vision Zero is to kind of make use of those resources that have been developed and the functional plans, master plans that have been developed, especially since that time, and take into account Vision Zero and safety. And so those should be used when designing the streets adjacent to new developments. And in addition to that, recommendation is for the transportation consultants to check the accuracy of those resource sources, like the bicycle level of traffic stress, as well as the pedestrian level of comfort, those maps, and make sure those are matching the existing conditions. And then not only that, but any changes that are made with the development, those should then be reflected back into those resources, just to make sure that they stay up to date and reflect what is actually built with new developments. And the second recommendation is, so as the prioritizing human life over mobility is laid out, kind of beginning of the transportation chapter, we want to make sure that is again iterated in the mitigation priorities that are listed in the SSP. And undoubtedly, whenever a new development is proposed, especially in terms of traffic, there'll be competing priorities between different modes and different stakeholders. And so we want this list, which there's a similar list already developed, to prioritize kind of which treatments would get priority. And so we want to put any crash mitigation strategies at the top of this list as well, just to reiterate that commitment to Vision Zero and highlight that that is kind of the top of the list there. Then the next slide, kind of another bigger picture recommendation is with the two elements we discussed already, and then the next recommendations that I'll get into, kind of it requires prioritizing safety and kind of putting that in the forefront. And so we want to make sure that that's just not written in the guidelines and then gets sort of forgotten about, but that there's a specific person that will be kind of responsible and make sure that those are carried out through the development review process. And so having in the development review committee made up of different agencies and stakeholders for a specific development, that we want a specific Vision Zero representative on that committee, kind of to review all of the elements and make recommendations on how to incorporate those safety treatments into the design of the development. And then, so those three recommendations were a little bit more big picture, and now there's two actually related to the transportation impact study approach and how the transportation consultant would carry out that study and what they would include in the study. And so the first of these changes is building off of the existing. There's currently a pedestrian and bicycle impact statement that is required for development. And that sort of is a qualitative look at the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, documenting what exists, things like that. And so this first piece is sort of mimicking that, but as a Vision Zero impact statement. And so the consultant would describe sort of any elements of the site, the frontage that is related to safety, the high injury network, crashes, speeds, and then any recommendations for treatments or operations that would be from something like the Vision Zero toolkit to help improve safety. And so that, like I said, is more of a qualitative assessment looking more big picture at the site. And then kind of a more detailed look at things would be done through the multimodal tests. And like I mentioned earlier, since the previous LATR guidelines came out, the county has developed a number of resources, data and maps related to Vision Zero, and we want to make use of what is already developed and what will be what's currently being developed. And so we kind of added one additional test to the current multimodal tests, and that would be a safety system test. And that would make use of the predictive safety performance functions that the county is developing. And so those take a look at the existing characteristics of the transportation network and where crashes have occurred, and it uses that to predict, based on similar characteristics, where crashes are likely to occur. And so whenever a development is proposed, this Vision Zero test would use the existing site characteristics and estimate the number of crashes, and then would look at the proposed site characteristics, whether that increases the traffic volume, if there's any lane changes, anything like that. And with the kind of measurement of that test to reduce the number of estimated crashes based on those functions. Then the motor vehicle system test, we are keeping the existing capacity test. There's some modifications that Eric will get into after this, but in general, keeping the motor vehicle system test. And then moving to the previous LATR guidelines incorporated the pedestrian, bicycle, and transit system tests as well, but those currently have a trigger of 50 trips for that mode, and in the past 3 to 4 years have found that those are really have only been applied or have only been met for the very large scale developments in more urban areas of the county. And so we want to make sure that these tests are accounted for smaller scale developments as well, that we check those modes. So we've recommended that that trigger be moved to 5 trips per mode, would then warrant conducting that test. And that, aside from the ADA compliance test, which is a pretty significant undertaking for a consultant or developer to do. And so we kept that at the 50 trips. And then additionally, the pedestrian system test, we recommend using the pedestrian level of comfort as the measurement there, which is a sort of newer resource for the county. And then the bicycle system and transit system otherwise keeps the same test as the existing guidelines.
Okay. And thank you, Emily. I'm going to move on to another set of recommendations that we have that pertain to transportation. One has to do with how we treat our metro station policy areas in terms of evaluating traffic congestion. And a recommendation that we have is for the motor vehicle adequacy test in the red or metro station policy areas, that we would eliminate that adequacy test for motor vehicles. So there would be no LATR test for motor vehicles. However, we would retain the other multimodal tests in those areas for bike, ped, and transit, reflective of the multimodal character of our metro station policy areas. And I think the question is, well, why do we want to even do this? Well, one thing I think is important to understand is that actually this particular recommendation was brought forward and provided in 2016 in the planning board draft SSP that was transmitted to the county council. So frankly, we thought it was a good idea then. We think it's a good idea now. And largely we want to do this because, using these capacity-based, multimodal, capacity-based measures to evaluate traffic often puts us in conflict with our Vision Zero goals and objectives. So we think that's one reason that we want to remove this particular requirement in our metro station policy areas. And we think that, frankly, that this could facilitate development in those areas, and we can leverage the heavy investment we've had in Metro Rail and put that to good use. And as I said before, we already have a very multimodal character for these metro station policy areas. So, and we're retaining the tests for the other modes. So we think that this particular approach makes sense. And last but not least, most of the metro station policy areas have a fairly robust street grid that tends to disperse traffic. So we think that given that particular characteristic, that this particular recommendation makes sense to bring back for this SSP update. Then I want to move into what we're looking at in terms of recommendations for our transit corridors. There are a number of transit corridors that are defined in the county. Most of them are, in fact, all of them have planned BRT service along US 29, Georgia Avenue, and MD 355, Beersboro Road, and you see them displayed on the map. And what we're talking about in this particular recommendation is to relax the congestion standards along these roadways and increase that to 100 seconds per vehicle. Currently, what I categorize as transit corridor roadways traverse red, orange, and yellow policy areas, and certainly as they traverse the orange and yellow policy areas, the congestion standards in those areas are currently range from 51 to 80 seconds. And our experience in the Beers Mill Corridor Master Plan was that, maintaining those particular congestion standards, frankly, didn't make much sense. That it made more sense to increase them to facilitate and sort of pave the way for the planned BRT service in the area. So along these particular roadways that are seen displayed on the map, the congestion standards would be relaxed to 100 seconds per vehicle. Now, as I mentioned before, these roadways also traverse many of these transit corridors also traverse the metro station policy areas, so that in that particular case, because we've already made a recommendation that we would not have a standard for those metro station policy areas, this particular standard, the 100 seconds per vehicle standard, would not apply in metro station policy areas, but it would apply outside of those policy areas as those transit corridor roadways are in the county. Why isn't my slide? For some reason I'm getting hung up here. It's not advancing. Uh-oh. What's happened here? Okay.
Keep going. You should be able to click again. There you go.
I'm not seeing anything on my screen. Is everybody seeing a blank screen, or are you seeing my presentation?
No, we see the map. Categorization. The map shows up with the areas, green, yellow, and orange. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm not seeing anything on my screen.
Currently on slide 21.
Hi, Eric. Eric, I would recommend resharing it.
Okay, let me do that. Can you just be patient? Thank you.
Sure thing.
Okay.
Okay, we can see it, Eric.
Okay, but I'm not seeing anything here, but at my end for some reason.
Do you want somebody else to share it?
If you could, that would be helpful, because I'm not seeing anything on my end.
Can.
Okay.
Okay, Jason, go ahead.
All right, just give me 1 second.
Looking in, what we see, Jerry says it's the open picture of the roadway to Bethesda.
Okay, let me just go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, and now,
Eric, can you see that?
I can see that. Yes, I can. Yes,
All right.
I can.
Is this where Eric?
So go back, continue back to recommendation 5.6. Oh, no, sorry, 5.7. I'm sorry, 5.7.
Okay.
You were there. Okay. Transit corridors. So I was discussing the transit corridors. So along the roadways that you see depicted on the map, along those particular roadways, the standards for intersection congestion would be relaxed to 100 seconds per vehicle, which in contrast to where we are now, as I mentioned before, it's roughly the range for those standards is 51 to 80 seconds. So this is a relaxing of those standards for those areas. And as I also mentioned before, that this mirrors what was done for the Veers Mill Corridor Master Plan in terms of a key recommendation that was an outcome of that plan. And so what this recommendation does is basically extend that recommendation countywide along all our BRT corridors in the county. Jason, can you advance it for me, please? Thank you. And so the table that you see here shows the comparison of the current standards along these roadways for congestion. As I mentioned before, they range from 80 to 51 seconds, and we're recommending that this SSP update recommends changing all of those standards to 100 seconds per vehicle. Next slide, please. Then we have another, next slide. We have another recommendation that pertains to the Purple Line Station policy areas. Those are Chevy Chase Lake, Long Branch, and Tacoma Langley. And what we're recommending is a change of the policy area categorization of these areas. And I've selected a dark red color. Now the color is really insignificant, but the proper point is to distinguish it, is to make a distinction of this policy area categorization from its current categorization. All of these policy areas, these three Purple Line Station policy areas are currently characterized as orange. And I'm making the recommendation that they be characterized as dark red. They wouldn't be red like the Metro Station policy areas, but it would simply be a hybrid between orange and red. And we think
Eric, aren't you overlooking the obvious? You could make them purple.
Well, you know what? I was there. It's all Jason's fault because
I will take the blame for that.
Okay, because there's a purple category for schools, and to avoid confusion. So I'm with you, Casey. I was there, but this is where we are. But
we can adjust the color scheme.
Okay.
Pink. Let's do pink.
Okay, but in any event, the point is to distinguish these three areas, these three policy areas from its current characterization. And the implications of doing that are, if you next slide, Jason, please. Well, in terms of why we want to do this, I think there's a clear recognition in the SSP that when we have these categorizations, that the policy areas can change over time, and the categorizations can change over time. And the major impetus behind making this change is the recognition that the Purple Line is imminent. It's under construction. It's going to be open in 2023, and so with that, there's an opportunity for increased transit service and opportunity to also leverage the development potential that service can bring. Next slide. So in this context, this recommendation would entail increasing the congestion standard in the three Purple Line Station policy areas. It's currently at 80 seconds per vehicle. With this change in categorization, the recommendation is to increase that to 100 seconds per vehicle, and this also would be consistent with the recommendation for our transit corridors as well. So we think this recommendation makes good sense. Next slide. And also the transportation impact tax rates would also change in this new area. Right now, what you see in this chart are the current impact tax rates for the red, orange, yellow, and green policy areas. With this new dark red category, I think there should be a hybrid between orange and red, and so you see the proposed impact tax rates for the land use categories here. And essentially what's been done here is just to split the difference between orange and red. So these rates that you see here represent the midpoint between orange and red for these various land use categories. These could be adjusted, but it's basically splitting the difference at this particular point in terms of impact tax for these areas. Next slide.
Jerry says you have a question on that.
Yes.
If you really do want to encourage development on the purple, why are you a little higher than the red policy areas? Or is there? I mean, should you make it the same as the red?
I think there an argument could be made to do that. I think one reason for considering that it's a hybrid is that even though the additional transit service is there, I think an argument could be made that it may not be, at least at the interim, quite at the level that we see in our current metro station policy area. So the policy area is evolving, and I think that as these areas become more mature, that they certainly could transition from dark red to red. But in the interim, this is basically a stepwise approach. Okay. But having said that, an argument could be made that you could conceivably make them all red, but I think that's a point of discussion that we can certainly have later.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Next slide. This particular recommendation pertains to our mobility assessment report. This is a document that we generally try to release roughly on a biennial basis. We quite haven't made that particular timeline with this next update of the mobility assessment report, but we hopefully we're bringing that to the board and releasing that in the not too distant future, certainly in concert with this SSP update, probably sometime this fall. But the idea is that we want to maintain, continue doing this report, and we think that it's important. We think that being able to assess and understand what the travel trends and the current condition of travel is in the county is important. We also think that this is a key monitoring element, transportation monitoring element that we want to maintain. And one thing that isn't explicitly, frankly, it isn't stated in the SSP working draft, but we also plan to change the name of this document from a mobility assessment report to a travel monitoring report. And because we think that that's more appropriate in terms of what the document is doing. And also we're thinking about marrying or combining the monitoring element of the bicycle master plan to the mobility assessment report. So we think it makes sense to have this report to evolve and just be called a monitoring report rather than an assessment report, still providing the same information, but having a more focused theme on monitoring as opposed to just reporting data. Next slide. So we're going to transition to Alex to talk about the policy review process.
Thanks, Eric. Again, this is Alex Rixey with Fair and Pierce DC, and I'll be presenting the recommendations for the policy area review for master plans. And just want to emphasize at the start of this section that unlike the previous recommendations, these recommendations are focused on master plan review and not on individual development site review. So with that said, there are 5 recommendations for policy area review, and I'll go through each one in turn. The first is auto and transit accessibility. So the proposed recommended metric there is the average number of jobs that can be reached within a 45-minute travel time by auto. and then another metric for the number of jobs that can be reached within a 45-minute travel time by walk access transit. And the idea there being to improve accessibility to jobs over the future baseline value. Apologies, that says existing there, but the actual recommendation is for the future baseline. And this would be calculated with the travel 4 model at a TAZ level. And so you can see on the map at the left that this really varies across the county, that some of the, generally the green areas have lower transit access to jobs, and the denser areas, but as in Silver Spring and along the 270 corridor, have higher access to jobs. But the overall metric is to look at the countywide weighted average of that. So changes in a particular master plan area could affect the accessibility to the jobs in that area, and also the ability of residents in that area to access jobs elsewhere in the county.
Alex, can I interject if I could?
Sure.
I think it's important to understand that these particular metrics are being proposed as a replacement for the current way that we evaluate master plans. Currently, we use the LATR process to evaluate master plans. We're looking at intersection delay and doing those projections 20, 25 years in the future. I don't think that's appropriate. I think that what we're proposing now is much more progressive, and I think that it's something that really warrants strong consideration and would move us away from the current process, which I don't think is really in keeping with maintaining, supporting the long-range planning goals of the county. So with that, I'll let Alex continue.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so in addition to what Eric was just describing, the other benefits of this metric are that they can really demonstrate a variety of trade-offs and considerations in the master planning process, so including the new destination options that might be available from land use program changes, changes in density of development, the level of congestion, not just immediately adjacent to the master plan area, but throughout the county, and any changes to the transportation network. Next slide. So the second recommendation in this group is the auto and travel times. So the proposed metric here is auto and transit travel times as an average trip time, considering all trip purposes, and improving that over future baseline conditions. So currently that's 16 minutes for auto and 50 minutes for transit, and with the current modeling, that's estimated to increase slightly to 19 minutes for auto and 52 minutes for transit on the future time horizon. So again, this will be calculated with the travel 4 model. At a pretty granular level, but again, looking at the average for travelers throughout the county, and again, taking into account the changes in the particular master plan area that's under review, but the implications of the changes in that master plan for travel throughout the county.
This is Natalie. Can you go back? Okay, just stay right there. I don't want to get into an argument right now, but I'm just letting you know that during the work sessions, I want to dig into this even more. 52 minutes for transit, that's way too long. If we really want to make a change, it should be less than that. So I don't want to hear you make a response on that. Just keep that in mind that that's where I stand. That way you should be doing better, not this. So.
Mr. Gray, this is Commissioner Patterson. We talked when you had your briefing before with the individual commissioners. I'm going to listen to the presentation, but I've already forewarned you that I have some concerns about what's being presented, and you've heard me talk about this when other applications have come forward regarding transit travel times and auto, as well as the congestion. So me being silent doesn't mean that I'm agreeing with what's being presented. I'm extending a professional courtesy to you to present.
I appreciate that, and it's understood. Thank you, Tina.
Jerry Sischke, I was going to weigh in too. I was kind of looking at the BRT, the Viers Mill Road, and looking at what you've defined there in terms of, going from a Rockville to Wheaton, kind of how do you improve that trip on basically, queue jumping for buses has been done, or priority to the signals. But again, I think that's an issue to maintain the viability of the transit system. So all the effort we're putting into it. The 29 corridor too, whether there's some queue jumping or something in an operational sense can be implemented. But the 52 seems is kind of high. But just a thought.
Thank you, Jerry. Sure.
Okay, thanks. So the next recommendation is related to vehicle miles traveled per capita, and the definition for that metric is the daily miles traveled per service population, and service population is defined as the sum of the total population and total employment for a particular TAZ. So the current and future baseline values for that are shown below. In terms of the methodology of how that's calculated, not to get too technical, but this is not a measure of the total amount of auto travel on Montgomery County roads, but it's the total amount of travel that is related to land uses in Montgomery County. So on the next slide, there's a graphic that helps to illustrate that. So the colorful graphic on the left shows what vehicle miles traveled are and are not included in this measure. So it includes all of the mileage of trips that happen completely within the county, and then there are a lot of trips that begin and or end outside of the county. So if only one part of the trip, for example, someone is traveling to commute from Fairfax County, for example, into a job location in Montgomery County, half of the mileage of that trip would be attributed to this total. And then this does not include pass-through trips of travelers that are merely passing through the county. So this is really focused on trying to tie the behavior, the travel behavior of residents and workers in Montgomery County to this outcome. And so again, this is a holistic measure that reflects changes in the distribution patterns of trips, in the lengths of those trips, and as well as in the mode of travel. So you could have changes in the population and employment of the county that might or might not result in additional vehicular travel depending on the mode of travel that's chosen. Next slide, please. So the next metric is non-auto driver mode share, which is a metric that's familiar, although typically this has been calculated in the county just for the commute purpose, and the proposal here is to calculate this based on all trip purposes, so commute as well as home-based shopping trips and other trips that take place in the county. And again, this is proposed to be calculated at a fairly granular level, but then rolled up to the county level so that you get the effect of any changes to the master plan throughout the county. Next slide, please. And then the final recommended proposed metric is bicycle accessibility, measured by the county-wide connectivity metric that's documented in the adopted county bicycle master plan. And the idea behind this metric is to estimate the potential bicycle trips that could be made and the percentage of those trips that are made on a low-stress bicycling network, defined as the network that's appropriate for most adults or appropriate for most children, so the two more comfortable categories in the county's level of traffic stress network. And this is consistent with the objective from Objective 2.1 from the Bicycle Master Plan. And this measures the connectivity and accessibility of trips, and also it serves as a proxy for safety, in that the more comfortable facilities are also tend to be the safer ones. Next slide, please. So this is just an illustration of where that metric is included in the bicycle master plan, and the threshold is the build out of that plan, so that 80% number, and then the graphic at the left shows how that also varies throughout the county, with typically better connectivity values kind of down county, and less connectivity on low stress facilities in the more rural portions of the county, but the overall intent is to reach that 80% county-wide, so a relative improvement over lower accessibility areas would still help the county reach that number. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Eric in case he has any closing remarks.
Sure. Well, that really concludes our briefing for the transportation element for the working draft, and I think at this point we'll open it up to any questions or comments.
Yeah, just quick, Jerry, again, that quick map, you got NIST on there in the blue, I guess, and you got another little white spot. That's not Shady Grove, is it? You got in the blue area. One is NIST.
I think that's NIST right there.
Yeah,
that's NIST.
And then you got another white area. That's not Shady Grove necessarily.
Frankly, Gerald, I'm not sure.
All right, I'm just curious. Yeah, never mind.
Okay. So, yes.
Are you done?
Yes, we are. Yes, Natalie. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, Look, I look forward to the work sessions. I am concerned and with a few things that were presented, but I will tackle them there. I am disappointed that you guys, I know I raised and I had at least one other planning board member who agreed on the issue on impact taxes. I have said in the past that if we want places like Glenmont, Burtonsville, Aspen Hill to redevelop, then we need to really take a look at on the impact taxes that we are putting forward. And I see them again, same story as the last SSP. So I look forward to talking about that.
Okay, fine.
But thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. You're welcome.
That point too has been made kind of on the east-west divide of the county and the 29. As I understand, I'll defer to your expertise, but impact taxes in the 29 corridor have been higher than other places, and therefore the development hasn't proceeded as we had hoped on the 29 corridor.
Exactly, that's the problem.
Okay,
and this doesn't fix anything. Let's talk about it in the work session.
This is Pratap Verma. I echo Vice Chair's sentiments. I think we really need to identify the areas that need the most help. The comments by Commissioner Sichi are also correct. The Purple Line stations, one that comes to mind is Littonsville. Even though it's going to be right next to transit, development for that area is going to be difficult for a wide variety of reasons. And what the Vice Chair is saying with vulnerable areas around Glenmont, Burtonsville, the entire Route 29 corridor that now is saying we do want development and catch up to a time where previously development was not occurring. I think we need to look at those areas that have been disproportionately affected post the Great Recession and see how we can use the growth policy to kind of invigorate those areas. And also looking at, in the red policy zones, some of it is just immediately around metro stations. Well, we know the walk sheds are significant around those areas. People are walking up to a quarter of a mile, maybe even a half a mile to access metro stations. So how do we encourage transit-oriented communities, which I believe is a new term, TOD is slightly going out of fashion. How do we encourage that? And I think the SSP, like all the commissioners have stated, the growth policy is the way to tackle it.
Okay. Thanks for that comment. Sure.
Yeah, I agree with the gist of what you guys are saying, but I'd call your attention to the highway capacity manual measurements. I think that's unhelpful in a lot of these areas outside of the red areas. And so don't overlook that when you're thinking about how to encourage development in some of these places. But I'm sure we'll come back to that during the work session.
Okay. Thank you, Casey.
Okay. Was there more?
No, there isn't any more, but I think, I guess I know that we are looking for the board's approval to move this forward, this working draft forward for the public hearing on June 11th. So
yeah, I'll take it from here, actually.
Okay.
Don't mind. Again, this is Jason Sartori for the record with Functional Planning and Policy at the Planning Department. So if I could, I'm just going to real quickly highlight some of the corrections that we've identified. I'm not going to go into detail of these, but we have a number that relate to figure numbering. I mentioned earlier some footnotes that should have been removed that are no longer applicable, some retitling of a table, and then some formatting things. Also, just again, some formatting things in the index. And then in the appendices, we have a few things. Probably the biggest highlight in here would be to add some transition language to the draft bill related to the validity period. We forgot to include that in there. We did include it with the others. That transition language will indicate that it should be effective January 1st. And then just some other things that kind of got lost in some of the formatting. So With that, the one other thing, one thing that I had in there was that we're going to add in the draft resolution for the county growth policy an indication of which, a reference to the map that we've displayed before with the school impact areas, but also a reference to which census tracts fall into each of those school impact areas. And so that's what you see here. I've gotten some communication since my item earlier with people wanting to know whether a specific parcel falls in or out of a particular area. Well, just by looking at this list of census tracts, they'll be able to answer that question themselves. So I'm going to keep this up on the screen for a second here, and we'll make this available in the public hearing draft that we published today. So with that, here's what we're asking. We're asking for you guys to accept for the planning board to accept the working draft as the public hearing draft with the errata that I just highlighted, and to set the public hearing as June 11th, and then to transmit that public hearing draft to the county council as required by county code as the staff draft of the subdivision staging policy.
Okay, if there's no other pressing questions, as I say, we're going to get into this in detail at the public hearing and in the work sessions. But for now, could we get a motion to
Chair, before you present the motion, I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr. Sartori, I did mention to you, I'm asking because we are in primarily a virtual environment that you use as many resources as possible to disperse both of these SSP documents.
Absolutely, and I'm going to be talking later today with our communications team about we have a press release that we'll be sending out, and we'll also make sure we reach out to the regional services centers and the Interfaith Advisory newsletter folks as well to try to get that information out.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Okay, could we get a motion to approve this as the working draft, transmit it to the county council as the staff draft or whatever the statute calls for, and set the public hearing date as recommended by staff?
This is Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. I move approval. I'm not loving this draft, but I'm moving forward with it.
Jerry Sishi, I will second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That's approved. Thank you all.